I knew something was wrong the second I stepped onto the basement stairs and heard that sickening slosh beneath my feet. At first, I thought maybe a pipe burst or the water heater finally gave up after 20 years, but nothing was worse. Much worse. When the lights flicked on, my stomach dropped. My entire basement, my home office, my gym, my retreat was sitting under 3 inches of cold, murky water. Papers floated like defeated soldiers, my treadmill was half submerged, and the smell, God, the smell hit me like a punch. But the real shock came later. After checking the security cameras, I saw it. HOA contractors at 1:47 a.m. digging a trench behind my property and redirecting an entire stream of runoff straight into my home. Not an accident, not nature, a deliberate water ambush. And that was the moment I realized, if the HOA wanted a flood, they were about to drown in consequences. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that trench-fresh dirt, tire marks, and those bright orange construction cones the HOA loved to buy in bulk. My basement was still damp, fans running at full blast, dehumidifiers humming like angry bees, and I was pacing the living room like a man waiting for a storm that had already hit. By morning, the sky was still gray, swollen with that heavy feeling right before another downpour. Perfect. Just what I needed. If they had really dug a trench redirecting runoff, the next shower would prove it without question. I grabbed my boots and went outside. The air smelled like wet soil and betrayal. I walked along the back fence and instantly noticed the ground sloping differently, subtle, but obvious to someone who had lived there 2 decades. The HOA's so-called landscaping improvements had created a gutter, a literal water highway leading right to my property line. It looked rushed, sloppy shovel marks, clumps of clay, and a path of crushed grass. Someone didn't care about quality. They cared about speed and secrecy. I crouched down, running my hand along the newly carved ditch. The curve of it wasn't natural. No rainfall had carved this. This was a human hand deciding that the easiest way to protect HOA property was to sacrifice mine. That's when I heard a voice behind me. "You're up early." It was my neighbor, Mark. Nice guy, retired firefighter. Always woke up before sunrise. "I'm checking the drainage," I said. He raised a brow. "Ah, so you noticed they were out here last night?" "Last night?" I turned fully toward him. "You saw them?" "Oh yeah," he said. "Truck came around midnight. I figured it was just some emergency work or something." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Did they tell you they were digging?" Of course they hadn't. HOA never told anyone anything unless it involved a fine. "No," I answered. "They didn't." He exhaled. That tracks. People didn't say things like that unless they had history." "Mark," I asked, "has the HOA ever messed with your property?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Not directly. But they did regrade the community field a few years back, and it caused flooding near the townhomes. Claimed it wasn't their fault." "And was it?" "Oh, absolutely their fault," he said, scoffing. "But they bullied the residents into shutting up." Bullied. A familiar pattern. As Mark walked away, I stood there staring at the trench again, anger slowly brewing into something heavier: determination. If they thought I was just another homeowner who'd shrug and write a complaint email, they picked the wrong guy. I grew up fixing farm drainage with my father. I knew erosion, slopes, grading, and runoff better than most people on that HOA board had ever known anything in their lives. Just then, raindrops started falling soft at first, that gentle pattering like fingertips tapping on a window. But within minutes, it turned into a steady shower. I stayed where I was, watching the water gather, form a stream, and then, just like I feared, race down the trench like a guided missile. The trench didn't spread the water. It funneled all of it, straight toward my house. The moment I saw the water curve around the slope and head directly to my basement wall, my hands clenched. My pulse spiked. This wasn't just negligence. It was precision. I marched straight to the HOA office. It was still early, but Karen, the HOA president, was always there before anyone else. Not because she worked hard, because she liked being important. Sure enough, she was inside, sitting at her desk, tapping away at her computer like she was typing the next constitution. I knocked once and pushed the door open. She didn't even look up. Office hours begin and I cut her off. We need to talk. She sighed dramatically, then turned her head slowly, as if I were interrupting some world-changing operation. Oh, it's you. Her smile was fake in the kind of way you could smell from 3 blocks away. How can I help? You redirected the drainage into my property. Her eyebrow twitched barely, but I caught it. I'm sorry, she said, voice soft but sharp like a razor. We made some temporary adjustments to the community drainage during maintenance. It is not directed at any homeowner. I have footage, I said. And I saw the trench myself. She leaned back, folding her arms. Sir, runoff patterns change naturally during rainfall. Perhaps your yard is simply not graded properly. My yard hasn't changed in 20 years. Well, she said, shrugging. Properties age, soil shifts. So you're telling me, I asked slowly, that the earth itself spontaneously decided to create a perfect little canal that leads water straight to my basement? She kept the fake smile, but her eyes hardened. You seem upset. I understand water damage can be frustrating. Frustrating? I stepped closer. My basement is flooded because of work your contractors performed without notifying residents. Her fingers tapped the desk impatiently. Drainage approval is HOA business, not yours. There it was, the HOA motto. We do what we want and you deal with the consequences. I laughed under my breath. Funny, because last I checked, my property is in HOA jurisdiction. Her lips thinned. She didn't like being reminded of that. She opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of papers. You should review the bylaws. Page 47 clearly states the HOA has full authority to manage landscape infrastructure. Landscape infrastructure, I repeated, not digging covert trenches that flood homes. She offered a dismissive wave. If you believe there's been an issue, you may file a complaint. Her voice shifted to that condescending tone she used whenever she needed to shut someone down. But I warn you, basements flood for many reasons. You don't want to embarrass yourself by accusing the HOA of something that's, well, beyond your understanding. Beyond my understanding. That phrase lit a fire in me. I leaned forward, planting both hands on her desk. Karen, if the HOA caused this, I'm not filing a complaint, I'm filing a claim. Her smile finally cracked. A claim? Against the HOA? That's right. She stood suddenly, voice rising. You cannot accuse us of wrongdoing without evidence. I have evidence. The color drained from her face for a split second. But she recovered fast. Her talent was pretending nothing ever rattled her. Well, she said, smoothing her blazer, feel free to pursue whatever actions you believe are appropriate. Translation, go ahead. You'll lose. I left her office without another word. Outside, the rain was coming down harder, pounding the pavement with increasing intensity. I walked back home, feeling that mix of fury and resolve tightening in my chest. I knew what had to be done, and I knew the HOA would do everything in their power to stop me. As I reached my backyard again, the trench was now a full-flowing canal. The water was rushing with such force that small sticks and gravel were tumbling through it like debris in a river. The stream hit the back wall of my basement foundation, splashing upward like a miniature waterfall. My phone buzzed. A text from another neighbor. Hey, did the HOA tell you anything about the drainage change? My yard is starting to pool water in weird spots. I stared at the trench. This wasn't just an accident. This was the beginning of something bigger. And the HOA had no idea I was just getting started. The smell hit me, first damp wood, soggy insulation, and the sharp sting of mildew that grows way too fast for comfort. It was the kind of smell that told you things had been wet long enough to become a real problem. I walked down the stairs slowly this time, every step squishing slightly beneath my feet. The fans I had running weren't doing much anymore. They were fighting a losing battle. The second storm was worse than the first. The moment the rain started pounding the roof like fists, I already knew what I'd find in the basement, but I still hoped maybe the water wouldn't come this time. Maybe last night was some freak anomaly. But hope is a funny thing. It shows up even when the facts are right in front of you, laughing. I turned the corner and flicked on the basement lights. More water. Much more. It wasn't standing still this time. It was flowing in, sliding along the floor in thin sheets before pooling into a large, spreading pond in the center. My gym mat floated like a sad island. A box of old photos I hadn't looked at in 10 years sat half submerged, the ink bleeding into strange watercolor patterns. And then the treadmill. My poor treadmill. I'd just repaired the incline motor a few months ago. Now the belt sagged with moisture, water dripping from the display panel like the machine itself was crying. My blood boiled. I pulled out my phone and started recording everything: close-ups, wide shots, timestamps. I measured water levels with a ruler. I photographed the wall where the seepage line had risen even higher than before. If the HOA wanted to play dumb, I'd give them evidence they couldn't ignore. By the time I went back upstairs, the storm had settled into a steady, relentless shower. Not violent, not dramatic, just persistent enough to worsen everything 1 hour at a time. I called the HOA emergency line. A recorded message said, "For true emergencies, dial 911. For all other inquiries, please email the HOA office. We respond within 35 business days, 3 to 5 business days." My basement had turned into a public swimming pool, and they wanted me to wait 5 business days. I checked my email. Maybe by some miracle Karen had sent something. Maybe for once she would act like a responsible adult. Nothing. Instead, what I did get was a knock on the door about an hour later. A big man in a reflective vest stood on my porch. His hat said Handyman Services, but the logo looked like it was printed on a home printer last night and ironed onto the fabric. "You the guy with the water issue?" he asked. "Who sent you?" I asked back. "HOA," he grunted. "Told me to take a quick look." I let him in because at this point, I needed someone to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. He walked down the basement stairs, paused halfway, sniffed once, and then shrugged. "Yeah, looks like water." I blinked. Water. Yes. "That's why you're here." He crouched and poked the puddle with one finger, like he was testing soup temperature. Damp," he muttered. I stared at him. "Do you have any licensing?" I asked. He gave a short laugh. "Licensing? For water? For drainage? For structural assessment? Lady at the HOA said you just needed someone to check if it was serious." "It is serious." He nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, looks serious." Then he stood up, wiped his hands on his vest, and said, "I'll tell them it's probably your foundation." "My foundation?" I repeated slowly. "Sure. Could be old. Could be cracked. Stuff happens." He was halfway up the stairs before I even processed what he'd said. "Wait. You haven't checked the walls. You haven't checked the exterior. You haven't checked the grating." He shrugged again. "Not my job. HOA just asked me to look. Looking done." And just like that, he left. 5 minutes later, I received an email from Karen. "Our contractor reports that your flooding is due to improper home maintenance and possibly aging structural issues. The HOA cannot be held responsible for individual homeowner upkeep. Please address your foundation problems independently to avoid future complications." I actually laughed, a short, humorless laugh that came from the place inside your soul where patience goes to die. Improper home maintenance? My house was in better shape than most houses in the neighborhood. I'd spent months waterproofing the basement myself years ago, added sump pumps, sealed the walls 3 times, and regularly checked the grating. My foundation was rock solid. I wrote back, "Your contractor didn't even inspect the outside of my property. He didn't take measurements. He didn't check the source of the water. He touched a puddle and left." Her reply came within minutes. "As previously stated, the HOA is not responsible for personal property issues. Please refrain from accusatory language." Accusatory language. Apparently, stating facts was now a crime. I saved the emails in a special folder labeled Evidence HOA Watergate. At this point, I needed answers, not excuses. So I stepped outside again, this time in a raincoat, and walked to the back of my house. The trench was twice as full now. Water gushed through it like it had somewhere important to be. The slope had eroded further, creating a deeper channel. Even worse, the water was visibly carving the ground toward my foundation. Every minute, the soil around my basement wall washed away, grain by grain. I pressed my hand to the wall. It was trembling. Not from collapse yet, but from the pressure of water pushing against it from the outside. If this continued for weeks, I could lose a structural wall. My phone buzzed again, this time a call. It was my neighbor, Alicia. "Are you dealing with flooding too?" she asked, panicked. "What happened?" I said. "My backyard is turning into a swamp. The water's not draining toward the community ditch, it's coming this way instead." "Exactly." The new system the HOA created didn't just target me, it rerouted water for several homes. Did the HOA warn you? I asked. No. The only email I got was about repainting mailbox posts. Unbelievable. We talked for a few minutes. She mentioned her husband wanted to talk to the HOA, but expected they'd say it was normal rain. Another neighbor had noticed pooling too. Another saw the HOA truck late at night as well. This wasn't isolated. This was widespread. And yet they sent a handyman with a finger-poking technique to diagnose structural flooding. By mid-afternoon, the rain had slowed, but the damage was done. I went back inside and checked my basement a third time. The water level had risen another quarter inch. It didn't sound like much, but in a basement, a quarter inch can be thousands of dollars. I took more videos, more photos, more measurements. I wasn't just angry anymore. I felt betrayed. I was part of this community long before Karen showed up, with her binders full of bylaws and her obsession with authority. I planted trees here. I fixed my neighbors' fences. I shoveled snow for elderly couples. I cared. And the HOA repaid that by drowning my basement to save a few dollars in drainage maintenance. That night, long after the rain stopped, long after the streets dried, I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook, writing down everything I needed to do next. Hire a real professional inspector. Document every interaction. Get weather reports. Get soil composition maps. Get runoff diagrams. Track water flow patterns. I wasn't going into the next HOA meeting as an angry homeowner. I was going in as a man armed with evidence. Because one thing I knew for sure, if they caused this mess, they were going to clean it up and pay for every last drop. I spent most of that night hunched over my kitchen table, surrounded by papers, screenshots, and rainfall logs. I wasn't just trying to prove a point anymore, I was building a case. When you've lived long enough dealing with HOAs, you eventually learn one hard truth. They only listen to paperwork, pressure, or lawyers. Sometimes all three. I knew the next step couldn't just be me yelling into the void. I needed a professional opinion, someone who understood hydrology, soil grading, and water displacement better than any HOA handyman with a reflective vest and a finger-dipping technique. So the next morning, after about 3 hours of sleep, I started calling around. Most companies were booked for weeks. Some didn't handle residential drainage. A few said they'd take a look for a basic fee, but made it clear they weren't licensed to do engineering reports. I needed someone licensed, certified, someone whose word was worth more than Karen's snippy emails. That's when I found him. Daniel Pierce, hydrologist and civil engineer. 20 years of experience, specialized in residential flooding cases, had testified in court multiple times against property management groups. Perfect. When I called, his receptionist said he could come the same afternoon. I booked it so fast I nearly hung up before she finished confirming. When Daniel arrived, he stepped out of his truck with a kind of calm confidence that immediately lowered my blood pressure. Tall, mid-50s, wearing a waterproof jacket and carrying equipment I didn't even recognize. Roans, laser levels, soil probes, a tablet strapped to his arm. Basement flooding? He asked. Directed water? I corrected. He paused, eyeing me with interest. Directed how? You'll see. We started outdoors. Within 5 minutes, he was shaking his head. This trench wasn't formed by erosion, he said. This was cut, recently, and not by a professional. He pointed at tool marks along the sides. Someone used a square shovel and didn't even bother smoothing the grade. This is the kind of work you get when people want a fast result, not a correct one. We followed the ditch uphill. He mapped the slope using his laser and tablet, murmuring to himself. Then he stopped. Oh, this is bad. What? I asked. He pointed. Your lot is actually slightly higher than the HOA common ground up there. Normally, water should flow away from your property, but they reshaped the terrain. See this ridge? He gestured at a freshly raised slope. That's not natural. Somebody pushed dirt here, just enough to make the water divert around it, and right into my house, I said. Exactly. We kept walking, and when we reached the top of the trench, Daniel crouched and took a soil sample. The dirt was loose, freshly turned, still holding the moisture pattern of recent digging. This work was done within the last 48 hours, he confirmed. I felt validation flooding through my chest. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined it. The HOA did do this. We moved to the back of my house. He inspected the foundation, checked seepage points, tested the wall moisture with a probe, and documented everything meticulously. "This is entirely external water pressure," he said. "Your foundation is solid. The waterproofing job you did is holding up well, but nothing is designed to withstand artificially redirected volume." He took photos, measurements, and even conducted a small dye test by pouring a fluorescent-safe solution into the trench and watching it seep into the exact crack in my wall. His final verdict hit like a thunderclap. "This flooding is 100% due to improper grading performed uphill, and because it's on HOA property, they're the responsible party." I exhaled slowly. "Can you put that in writing? I can put it in a full engineering report. And video? I can produce a video summary if needed. And can you testify?" He smiled faintly. "If it comes to that." We headed inside. I showed him the basement. He measured water levels, inspected damage, and took photos that made my stomach twist. Mold forming near the baseboards, warping wood, damp insulation. Even parts of my framing were compromised. "You're looking at tens of thousands in restoration," he said plainly. "Maybe more." I nodded. "I expected that. But the real cost," he continued, "is what they'll need to fix outside. They have to correct the grading, install proper drainage infrastructure, and waterproof the affected areas. You're looking at, I'd estimate, around $90,000. $90,000. I swallowed hard. "And they'll have to pay it?" "With this report," he said, "they won't have a choice." After Daniel left, I sat at my dining table again this time with a folder full of evidence so airtight it might as well have been wrapped in steel. But evidence alone didn't win HOA battles. You had to strategically deploy it. So, I prepared for the upcoming HOA meeting. I printed copies of Daniel's preliminary assessment, I printed the photos, I had video ready on a USB stick. I organized my emails from the HOA in chronological order, highlighting every lie, every deflection, and every time they blamed me for the mess they created. That night, I barely slept again. But this time, it wasn't stress keeping me awake. It was anticipation. The meeting was scheduled for 6 p.m. the next day. When I arrived, the room was already packed. More people than usual, probably because the last storm had affected multiple homeowners. I saw Alicia, Mark, and at least 6 other neighbors who'd contacted me earlier. Karen stood at the front, clipboard in hand, wearing a bright blazer that practically screamed, "I'm in charge." She looked confident, too confident for someone whose decisions had caused multiple properties to flood. She started the meeting with her usual monotone. "Welcome, everyone. Let's keep things orderly and respectful. We'll begin with community updates," and I raised my hand. She ignored it. As I was saying, maintenance this month will include... I raised my hand higher. She pressed her lips together. "Yes, you have something to add?" "I have something to present." Her smile froze. "Present?" "This is not the time for... It's related to the drainage changes performed 3 nights ago." The room suddenly went quiet. People shifted in their seats. The couple in the corner whispered to each other. Someone muttered, "Finally." Karen cleared her throat. There were no changes, only temporary adjustments, and they were entirely safe and well within HOA jurisdiction. I walked to the front table, placed a stack of printed reports on it, and plugged my USB into the projector. "What are you doing?" Karen snapped. "Showing the truth," I said simply. The projector flickered on, revealing a high-resolution drone shot of the trench. Gasps rippled through the room. People murmured. Someone said, "Wait, that's behind our house too." I clicked to the next slide. Daniel's analysis, then the dye test video. Then the photos of my basement. Karen's face lost all color. This is misleading," she stuttered. "This is one homeowner's interpretation." "Actually," I said, "this is a state-licensed hydrologist's professional assessment, with credentials, documentation, and data. Would you like me to read his conclusion aloud?" The room leaned forward collectively. "No," Karen snapped. "This meeting is not for..." But it was too late. People were whispering about the photos, pointing at the trench, talking about the pooling in their own yards. A man stood up. "Why weren't we informed of this work?" A woman added, "Why did my kid's playground flood yesterday?" Another said, "My shed has water damage." Karen tried to regain control. "Everyone, please. We are handling this internally." "No," I said. "You're covering it up." Her composure cracked. "You are being hostile." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "And you are being caught." A few board members exchanged nervous glances. You redirected water into private properties, I said, projecting my voice so everyone could hear, knowingly, without permits, without notifying residents. And then you tried to blame us. Someone shouted, "She needs to resign." Another voice, "We want to vote!" Karen slammed her clipboard down. "This is absurd. The HOA is blameless." I clicked to the final Slide Daniels summary with the phrase, "Flooding is a direct result of unauthorized terrain modification on HOA land." The room erupted. Karen turned scarlet. You don't understand the budget constraints. We needed a temporary solution until..." But she'd said too much. I repeated slowly, "Temporary solution. So you did alter the drainage." Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I lifted my phone and hit the play button. Her voice, recorded from my previous conversation, filled the room. "Drainage approval is HOA business, not yours." That was checkmate. Karen grabbed her bag and stormed out amid the shouts of angry homeowners. And I knew, as I stood there watching her leave, that the real battle was just beginning. But now I had the upper hand. The HOA meeting didn't end so much as it exploded. Even after Karen stormed out, people kept shouting across the room, questions, accusations, frustration boiling over after months, maybe years, of being ignored. I watched it all unfold from the front of the room, feeling the strange mixture of adrenaline, anger, and a quiet, growing sense of victory. But the board minus Karen finally managed to restore some order. 3 remaining members gathered behind the table and whispered amongst themselves. They looked shaken, pale, and completely unprepared to deal with the mess their president had created. One of them, a thin man with glasses too large for his face, cleared his throat and addressed the room. We appreciate everyone's feedback tonight. We will review the documentation provided and seek professional consultation." The room erupted again. "Review? People's homes are flooding. Do something now. This is negligence." The board members seemed like they were shrinking behind the table. I decided to step in, not for their sake, but because chaos wasn't going to move things forward. I raised my voice just enough to get the room's attention. "Everyone, please, I get it. I'm furious too. But if we want results, we need to handle this correctly." The shouting dimmed. People turned toward me. "I hired the hydrologist because I knew HOA wouldn't listen otherwise. The report is solid. The evidence is undeniable. If they don't fix this, we have legal grounds, strong ones." A woman in the back asked, "Do you plan on suing?" I answered honestly, "I will if they refuse to take responsibility. And based on the number of you dealing with similar issues, it might not just be me." Another man near the front nodded. "We should unite on this." The board fidgeted uncomfortably. I looked at them. "The longer you wait, the worse this gets. Tunnel the water back where it belongs, restore the grading, fix the drainage system, and repair the damage caused." They didn't answer, not immediately. The meeting ended shortly after, abruptly, awkwardly, and with promises of follow-up communication. I didn't believe a word of it. On the way out, several neighbors stopped to thank me, shake my hand, or share their own stories of the HOA ignoring them. It was obvious the board had lost the community's trust, and without Karen's iron fist holding everything together, the cracks were starting to show. I drove home thinking the worst was behind me. I was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to a knock on my door. A far too cheerful knock for someone delivering good news. When I opened it, there stood Karen, arms crossed, jaw clenched, eyes blazing with fury. Behind her were 2 HOA board members, looking like they deeply regretted being dragged along. "Good morning," I said, my voice flat. "This is harassment," she snapped before I even finished opening the door. "Harassment?" I repeated. "Yes," she barked. "You publicly humiliated me last night with fabricated evidence, sensational accusations, and illegal recording." The board members exchanged glances. One of them whispered, "Karen, maybe we should speak calmly." She whirled on him. "Calmly? He's attacking the HOA." I took a slow breath. First, the evidence isn't fabricated. Second, nothing was illegal. State law allows recording conversations where at least one participant consents. She blinked, thrown off for a moment, then recovered. "You manipulated the board and riled up the community." I pointed at the trench. The trench manipulated them. Her eyes narrowed into slits. "You're going to retract every statement you made, or the HOA will take disciplinary action." "Disciplinary action?" I said, stepping onto the porch. "My home isn't even under HOA jurisdiction. You have no authority over my property." "Oh, we'll see about that," she hissed. "You caused chaos, and we don't tolerate troublemakers." I actually laughed. "Karen, you redirected floodwater into my house." "That was a maintenance necessity," she shouted. "The community field was eroding. We had to reroute the stormwater for one night. Then why is it still rerouted?" She froze. The board members looked at the ground. I stepped closer. "You didn't move it for one night. You moved it indefinitely." She swallowed hard but refused to back down. "Regardless, you will not speak about this again. You will delete all footage, retract all claims, and stop threatening legal action." "And if I don't?" She raised her chin. "Then we'll see you in court." I smiled. "Great, I already have a lawyer." Something flickered across her expression, fear, but it quickly morphed into rage. "This isn't over," she spat. "I know," I said. "That's why I'm documenting everything." I lifted my phone and snapped a picture of her standing on my porch. "What are you doing?" she screeched. "Documenting," I repeated. She stormed away, the board members trailing behind her like defeated soldiers in a retreat. As she reached the end of my driveway, she turned back one last time and shouted, "You'll regret crossing the HOA," I called back. "Not as much as you'll regret crossing a hydrologist." She disappeared around the corner. 2 hours later, I received an email from the HOA. Per HOA bylaws, homeowners are expected to refrain from making defamatory statements about the association. Failure to comply may result in community fines. I replied, "Fines do not apply to non-HOA properties. This is now a legal matter." I attached Daniel's initial report. That afternoon, I received another email from the vice president of the board this time, not Karen. It was a complete shift in tone. "We would like to meet with you to discuss possible remedies." Translation: "We're terrified." I wasn't going to let them wiggle out with vague promises. I forwarded the email to my lawyer. He called me almost immediately. "Good. They're panicking. Let's use that." We drafted a formal demand letter with a list of damages, repair costs, and required corrective actions. The number came out to $89, $750, almost exactly what Daniel estimated. My lawyer sent it with a note. Failure to comply within 7 business days will result in litigation. Less than 24 hours later, the HOA board requested an emergency session with me and my attorney. Karen was noticeably absent. When I sat across from the remaining board members in a cramped conference room, they looked like they'd aged a decade overnight. They offered me coffee, water, even cookies, anything to soften the blow. My lawyer didn't accept a thing. "Let's get to it," he said. The board members attempted diplomacy. "We understand your frustration. We acknowledge the mistakes made. We want to work together to find a solution. We believe in community harmony." Then came the big one. "We are willing to make repairs." "Repairs," my lawyer repeated calmly. "Define repairs." One board member fidgeted with his pen. "We can regrade the trench, maybe add some gravel." My lawyer cut him off. "Not enough." Another member cleared his throat. "We can add a drain." My lawyer shook his head. "Not enough." Finally, the treasurer whispered, "We can waterproof the basement." My lawyer leaned forward. "Not enough." The board stared at him, then at me. I folded my arms. "You flooded my home. You damaged my foundation. You jeopardized my structural walls. My entire basement is destroyed, and your system endangers several households." They looked defeated. My lawyer placed the demand letter on the table. "You will install a complete drainage system, regrade the land professionally, waterproof the basement, restore all damaged property, and cover all engineering costs. And," I added, "you'll remove Karen from the board." The board exchanged wide-eyed looks. One whispered, "We can't just..." Another interrupted, "Actually, we can." The vice president sighed. She violated procedure, hid the contractor details, and gave unilateral approval. It's grounds for removal. I didn't feel bad, not even a little. The meeting ended with the board agreeing verbally for now to comply. But verbal agreements weren't enough. My lawyer smiled as we walked out. "They have no choice," he said. "They know it." That night, I slept for the first time in days. Not because things were resolved, but because I finally felt the tide turning. They tried to bury me in water, but they were the ones drowning now. The following week was strangely quiet, too quiet. Whenever an HOA suddenly goes silent, it's never because they've become reasonable. It's because they're plotting. And sure enough, The calm broke on a Wednesday morning when I received a thick envelope shoved into my mailbox. It wasn't mailed. Someone had hand-delivered it, sloppy, rushed, and a little too aggressive. Inside was a letter 3 pages long, full of legal jargon the board clearly didn't understand, and the signature at the bottom made my jaw clench. Karen. She wasn't done. According to her official notice, the HOA was rejecting my claims, refusing liability, and accusing me of creating hazardous conditions on my own property that contributed to the flooding. She even suggested that my landscaping had caused water to flow uphill. Uphill. I read the sentence 3 times just to confirm it wasn't a hallucination. Water, according to Karen, had decided it no longer obeyed gravity. It was climbing slopes now, defying physics, all so the HOA wouldn't be responsible. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the audacity was so extreme it crossed into comedy. I forwarded the letter to my lawyer. He called within minutes. "She wrote this?" he asked, stunned. Apparently, he chuckled. "Well, good news. This is going to help us even more. How? Because this is reckless. She wrote false statements, misrepresented responsibility, and contradicted multiple state regulations. This is the kind of letter judges love." He paused. "It's also the kind that gets HOA presidents fired." I smiled. That was already in motion, but hearing it phrased so cleanly was satisfying. He continued, "Don't respond. Let the board dig their own hole. We'll handle everything." I trusted him, but it didn't stop the anger simmering in my chest. Not because of the letter, but because I knew this was Karen's attempt to regain control. She wasn't president of the board anymore, in a political sense, but she still tried to run the neighborhood like a dictator who didn't know she'd already been dethroned. But she wasn't prepared for what came next. 2 days later, the HOA board held an emergency meeting, this time without Karen. The room was full again, but this atmosphere was different. Tense, heavy, but expectant. The vice president tapped the microphone. "We need to address recent issues regarding drainage." Someone shouted from the back. "You mean the flooding?" Another yelled. "Where's Karen? She needs to answer for this." The VP raised his hands. "Karen is no longer acting in her role while we conduct an internal review." Internal review. Translation, she's out, at least for now. People started whispering urgently. The whole room was buzzing. Then the VP continued. "We've received a report from a licensed hydrologist confirming the drainage issue." I crossed my arms, watching. "And," he added nervously, "we recognize our responsibility." The room fell silent. Not a whisper, not a breath. Homeowners weren't used to hearing the HOA admit fault. It was like watching a unicorn walk onto the stage. "The HOA will work with a licensed engineering firm to remedy the drainage issue," the VP said. "We will also discuss compensation for damages incurred by affected homeowners." Someone clapped, then someone else. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding. People stood up, cheering, relieved, but I stayed seated, because I knew it wasn't over. Sure enough, a woman near the front raised her hand. "Who approved the trench work in the first place?" The VP shifted uncomfortably. "That is, under investigation." People looked around. Everyone knew the answer. Everyone knew who approved it. But before anyone could push further, the room suddenly buzzed with the sound of a slamming door. Karen barged in like a storm in heel-share wild, eyes blazing, papers flying from the folder she clutched too tightly. "I will not be silenced," she shouted. The room froze. The VP whispered, defeated. "Oh God," Karen stomped to the front of the room. "This is a conspiracy, a witch hunt. I did nothing wrong. The drainage trench was necessary. I saved the community from erosion damage." A man in the back yelled, "You flooded our basements? I did what I had to do for this community," she screamed, banging her fist on the podium. Someone shouted, "You broke the law!" Another yelled, "Step down already!" Karen pointed wildly at the VP. "You're spineless, all of you. You're letting him," she jabbed a finger at, "me destroy everything we built." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean the trench? The illegal modification? The damage to half the neighborhood?" She turned purple. "You caused the flooding." I blinked slowly. "Right." "The trench you had dug at 1 in the morning?" Gasps filled the room. Karen froze. She knew she slipped. I continued calmly. "I have footage, remember?" People murmured, whispering urgently. Karen tried to recover. "It wasn't my idea. It was... She stuttered, looking around desperately. It was the contractor. Which contractor? Someone asked. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No name came out. The VP sighed into the microphone. Karen, please leave. The board has voted to suspend your authority. Karen shrieked, a long, ear-piercing sound that made several people flinch. I wrote the bylaws! I run this community! You can't do this to me! But the room wasn't on her side anymore. Neighbors stood, people pointed. A few recorded her meltdown with their phones. She backed away slowly, realizing she wasn't just losing the presidency, she was losing control completely. Her reign was crumbling. She stormed out again, slamming the door even harder than the first time. The VP sighed. Moving on, he addressed me next. We reviewed the demand letter from your attorney. We are prepared to negotiate. Negotiate? I asked. Well, yes. We can offer a portion of the cost. Maybe half? The room buzzed with disbelief. I didn't raise my voice. Half won't cover the damage, and half won't fix the drainage. He winced. But the HOA budget, then reallocate it, someone interjected loudly. Fix what you broke. The VP swallowed hard. We need a full vote from the board. My lawyer, seated beside me, leaned toward the microphone. Under state law, the HOA is liable for damage caused by unauthorized land modification. If we proceed legally, the cost will be higher than the proposed fix. Much higher. The VP slumped. We'll take that into consideration. The meeting ended soon after, but I knew the board now understood. They couldn't win a legal fight. Later that night, I received a call from the treasurer. He spoke quietly, tension in his voice. We've reviewed the expenses. We literally don't have the remaining funds unless we raise fees. People won't accept that. Then what's your plan? I asked. We may have to use the reserve account. HOA reserve accounts are supposed to be untouchable, used only for major emergencies. That's your only option, I said. He sighed. We'll be in touch. The next morning, the HOA released an official statement to the entire neighborhood in email with formal language, carefully written to avoid using the words fault or negligence. But the message was clear. The HOA agreed to fully pay for all drainage corrections, regrading, waterproofing, and basement restoration. Total cost, $90,000. I stared at the email as satisfaction washed over me. It wasn't just about the money, it was the principle. They had tried to bury me in water. They'd lied, denied, threatened, insulted, and twisted every rule to protect themselves. But the truth had weight. Evidence had power. And Karen's arrogance had finally collapsed under pressure. 2 days later, construction crews arrived at my property, real crews this time, licensed, professional, equipped with machines, survey tools, and blueprints. The HOA board stood far off to the side, watching like people witnessing their own funeral. The first thing the workers did was fill in the trench. Then they restored the original grading. After that, they installed a French drain system, a sump pump line, new drainage channels, soil stabilization grids, and waterproof membranes along the side of my basement wall. It took a week. A long, noisy, muddy week. But at the end of it, my land was better than it had ever been. And the HOA paid for every cent. Karen? She disappeared. Word around the community was she skipped town after the board voted to remove her permanently. Nobody knew where she went, and nobody cared. When I looked at my newly restored property, I felt something I hadn't in weeks: relief and victory. Because they tried to ruin me. Instead, I forced them to build a drainage system so perfect it should have come with a plaque engraved with my name. The drainage crew was still finishing the final touches when I noticed something interesting. Neighbors, lots of them, had started gathering on the sidewalk. At first, it was just curiosity. Who wouldn't stare at an entire engineering team tearing up and rebuilding the landscape? But as the hours went by, the crowd grew. People pointed at the heavy equipment, whispered about what the HOA must be paying, took photos, asked questions. It wasn't long before the whispers became conversations. Then, conversations became complaints. Then, complaints became momentum. I watched it all unfold from my porch, coffee mug in hand, still enjoying the quiet satisfaction of seeing the HOA's budget evaporate in real time. After everything they put me through, the lies, the gaslighting, the threats, they now had to stand here helplessly while professionals fixed what never should have been broken. and they hated every minute of it. The vice president and treasurer lingered near the curb, muttering to each other like two kids caught breaking a window. I could almost feel the stress radiating off them. They kept glancing my way but avoided eye contact, as if I were the ghost of consequences haunting their afternoon. Finally, the VP approached. He cleared his throat. The workers might need access to your side yard for the waterproofing. I nodded. Of course. He hesitated. And, the board wanted to express our appreciation for your cooperation. I sipped my coffee. It's not cooperation, it's accountability. He swallowed hard. Yes. Right. Accountability. As he walked away, another neighbor approached me, Alicia, the one whose backyard had started pooling with water. She folded her arms and said, "You know, you kind of saved the neighborhood." I chuckled. I just didn't want my basement to turn into a lake. Well, the HOA wasn't taking anyone else seriously, she said. They needed someone persistent enough to fight back. Persistent. That was a generous word for what I'd been the past few weeks. Obsessed, sleep-deprived, angrier than I'd ever been in my life. But persistent had a nicer ring to it. Then she lowered her voice. "People are talking about removing the entire board, you know?" I raised a brow. "Really?" She nodded. "Karen's gone, but she wasn't the only problem. Half the board backed her up. Let it happen. Hid things, ignored complaints. And what are they planning to do?" I asked. "Special vote," she said. "Soon." Interesting. As the day went on, the crew began installing the largest component of the system, the French drains. They dug deep trenches, lined them with permeable fabric, laid thick pipes, filled them with gravel, and sealed everything with reinforced soil layers. One of the workers, a guy built like a linebacker with a thick southern drawl, walked over to me and said, "Man, this is one fancy drainage system. Whoever designed this knows what they're doing. The HOA's paying for all of it," I said casually. He let out a whistle. "They're gonna feel that one." "Oh, they're already feeling it," he laughed. "Good. Some of these HOAs need a lesson." At around 4 p.m., the hydrologist Daniel returned to inspect the progress. He reviewed the new slopes, double-checked the grading, and inspected the installed pipes. He nodded approvingly. "They're doing it right," he said. "No shortcuts." "Good," I said, "because they're paying premium money." He smiled. "Sometimes justice is expensive." As he left, I felt something shift inside me. Not just satisfaction, not revenge, something deeper, something steadier. Vindication. I'd been right. I'd been patient. And I hadn't backed down. By the end of the day, most of the major work was complete. The crew would return tomorrow for waterproofing and final adjustments, but the worst was over. For the first time in weeks, I didn't go to bed wondering if my basement would flood again. But the HOA, they weren't sleeping easy. 2 mornings later, I stepped outside to find a large white envelope taped to my door. The HOA's official letterhead sat neatly at the top, but the content inside wasn't what I expected. It started with, "We wish to resolve all matters amicably," a good sign. But then the letter continued. "In exchange for repairs funded by the association, we request that you sign the enclosed non-disclosure agreement and non-disparagement clause to prevent further damage to community reputation." I stared at the page. Then I laughed. A loud, full-body laugh that probably startled a squirrel or two. They repaired my home because they were forced to. They paid for the drainage because they had no choice. And now they wanted me to pretend none of it happened. My laughter stopped abruptly. I grabbed a pen and wrote a single sentence across the NDA in big, bold letters. Absolutely not. Then I walked the envelope to the mailbox. Not to send it back, but to drop it straight into the recycling bin. My lawyer called that afternoon. "They tried to get you to sign an NDA?" "Yep." He exhaled sharply. "They really don't understand how liability works, do they?" "Nope." He chuckled. "Well, this actually helps us again. If they're asking for an NDA, it means they know they're in trouble." We ended the call, and I spent the rest of the evening watching the sunset over my newly restored yard. The slope looked perfect. The drain lines were seamless. The water testing markers showed everything flowing in the correct direction. For the first time since this nightmare began, I truly relaxed. But the real twist came later. 3 days after the drainage system was fully completed, the county inspector showed up. He had a clipboard, a badge, and the kind of posture that said he didn't come for small talk. "Are you the homeowner?" he asked. "Yes." I need to speak with you about a report regarding unauthorized land modification in this neighborhood. My eyebrows lifted. Oh? And who filed the report? He showed me the form. Daniel, the hydrologist. He had filed it almost immediately after finishing his assessment, citing state regulations requiring him to report major environmental violations. What exactly is the county looking into? I asked. The inspector flipped through his notes. The HOA appears to have performed unpermitted grading, redirected stormwater, and potentially caused structural risk to multiple homes. This is a violation of state code. We'll be auditing the HOA's records. I had to steady myself. What's the penalty? He shrugged. Could be fines, could be forced remediation, could be legal action, depends on how much we find. When he left, something settled over me. A final piece of justice. The HOA didn't just have to fix the damage. They were now being investigated by the state. Within a week, word spread around the neighborhood. Neighbors whispered. The board panicked. And eventually, the treasurer sent out a mass email. Due to ongoing investigations and recent events, the HOA board will hold a full community vote for new leadership. The community voted. Karen, banned from ever holding a position again. Removed from the HOA permanently. Her remaining supporters lost their seats too. A new board was elected, one that actually cared about transparency, safety, and communication. As for my basement, restored, upgraded. Better than before. As for the drainage, perfect. Zero water issues, even during the worst storms. One afternoon, as I stood outside looking at the pristine slope and clean foundation, one of the workers joked, "Honestly, this system is so good you could sell tickets to come admire it." I laughed. Maybe I should, but inside, I felt a heavy weight lift. They tried to drown me. They tried to blame me. They tried to intimidate me. They tried to silence me. And instead, they paid $90,000 to fix the mess they caused, and lost everything they thought they controlled. The funny thing about peace is that you don't notice when it starts, you notice when it returns. For weeks, I'd lived with this constant knot of stress in my chest, the kind that only loosened once the last drainage pipe was laid, the last trench filled, and the last contractor truck rumbled down the street. Suddenly, my yard was quiet again. No machinery. No HOA board members lurking around pretending to supervise. No angry emails, no threats, no drama, just normal. It felt strange, but the real shift came from the neighborhood itself. People I barely knew began stopping me on my daily walks. Some thanked me, some apologized for not stepping in sooner. Some simply wanted to share stories about how they'd been afraid of Karen, about fines they'd gotten for ridiculous reasons, about being ignored whenever they raised concerns. And while those stories were frustrating to hear, there was something comforting about the honesty. For the first time, the residents were talking to each other instead of whispering behind closed doors. One evening, Alicia walked over while I was adjusting the new drain exit point along my side fence. She carried a stack of papers and wore a grin that suggested she had good news. "You're going to want to see this," she said, handing me the documents. I flipped through them. "A petition?" "Not just a petition," she said proudly. "A set of new community rules the new board wants to implement. Transparency requirements, contractor validation, mandatory vote approvals for any major changes." And she tapped one page a new environmental compliance clause. I raised a brow. Inspired by our recent flood? Exactly. It was impressive. More professional than anything the HOA had produced in years. I scanned the signatures, many names I recognized, including some who had once been fiercely quiet under Karen's regime. "So," I said, lowering the papers, "the neighborhood has finally woken up?" "It's a start," she replied. "People needed a push." I folded the petition and handed it back. "Well, if they need help convincing the board, I have no problem showing up again." She laughed. "Let's not traumatize the new board on their first week." Fair enough. Later that night, I walked into my basement, the one place I'd avoided even after it had been fully restored. The contractors had done an incredible job. The walls were freshly sealed and insulated, the flooring replaced with waterproof vinyl planks, and even my gym area looked better than before. But what mattered wasn't the look. It was the smell. No dampness, no mildew, no rot. Just clean, dry air. I sat on one of the workout benches, taking a slow breath. It was finally over. Or so I thought. The next morning, while sipping coffee on my porch, Daniel, the hydrologist, pulled up in his truck again. At first, I panicked, thinking something was wrong. But he waved and smiled, climbing out with a tablet in hand. "Before you worry," he said, "everything looks good. I'm just here to give you the final sign-off." I exhaled. Good. Because if something else goes wrong, I might just build a moat around the property. He chuckled. Well, that would be one way to handle an HOA. He scanned the drainage, took a few final readings, and nodded approvingly. "Honestly," he said, "this is one of the best residential drainage systems I've seen installed. Ever. They went above and beyond. They had to," I said. "It was either that or a courtroom." He grinned. "Sometimes pressure makes diamonds." As he got ready to leave, he paused. "By the way, county inspectors found more violations. A lot more. They're filing fines this week." "How bad?" I asked. "Bad enough that the old board wouldn't have survived even without your case." I clicked my tongue. I'd say, poor things, but I'd be lying. He laughed, climbed into his truck, and drove off. Just like that, the last loose end tied itself neatly. Over the next few days, life eased back into something resembling normality. I fixed the mailbox Karen had once said was unapproved height. I trimmed the bushes she'd threatened to fine me for. I even repainted part of the fence she'd claimed was a visual disturbance. Now that she was gone, those tasks felt less like chores and more like reclaiming territory. But the biggest shift came at the community barbecue, a tradition that Karen used to run with a level of micromanagement usually reserved for surgical operations. This time, the vibe was completely different. Kids ran around the park. Dogs played fetch. People laughed. Music played from a portable speaker without Karen screaming about noise violations. The new board members mingled freely, answering questions, accepting suggestions, even apologizing when needed. And then something happened that caught me off guard. The new HOA presidente, calm, level-headed guy named Sam stood up and tapped a spoon against a cup to get everyone's attention. The crowd quieted. "I want to take a moment," he said, "to acknowledge someone who didn't ask for trouble, didn't want conflict, but refused to let wrongdoing slide. Someone whose persistence and, frankly, stubbornness saved this neighborhood thousands of dollars in future repair costs and kept our homes safe." People turned and looked at me. Oh, great. Public recognition. My favorite. Sam continued. "We owe a huge thank you to our neighbor who exposed the issues, documented the evidence, and made sure things were handled the right way." The crowd started applauding, loudly, then cheering. I stood there awkwardly, lifting my hands in a "please stop clapping." I'm not a hero gesture, but it didn't work. Sam raised his voice over the applause. And because of his actions, the board has passed a new rule unanimously. From now on, all major landscaping or drainage work must go through a full environmental assessment and community vote. The applause grew even louder. Alicia nudged me. "See? Save the neighborhood." I whispered back. "I didn't save anything. I just didn't let them drown me." She smirked. Same difference. Eventually, the crowd settled back into normal party chatter. Kids resumed running around. The grill fired up again. I found myself standing near the park path, just watching, quietly, contently. And then, because the universe has a sense of humor, I overheard two neighbors talking 10 feet away. First neighbor. "Man, can you believe the HOA had to pay 90 grand because of that trench Karen dug?" Second neighbor. "Honestly, best money they ever spent." I smiled. Later that evening, as the sun went down and the barbecue wrapped up, I took one last walk through the community. People waved from porches. A couple of them asked me questions about the drainage system, wondering if they should consider installing something similar on their slopes. It felt surreal, being the water expert of the neighborhood. I didn't plan on becoming the unofficial flood fighting representative, but life has a funny way of assigning roles. When I finally returned home, I walked around to the backyard. I stood on the edge of the now perfect slope, looking toward the common area beyond the fence. The grass was trimmed, the soil was stable. The drainage path flowed naturally, effortlessly, exactly the way nature intended, without human meddling. A small bird landed near the new drain exit point, pecking at the moist soil. Peaceful. Normal. Right. I realized something then. This wasn't just about repairing damage or getting compensation. It was about drawing a line that said, you don't get to push people around, you don't get to bully homeowners. You don't get to cover up your mistakes. You don't get to gamble with someone else's property. And you definitely don't get to dump floodwater into my basement. Not without consequences. As the last glow of sunlight faded, I closed my eyes for a moment and just listened. No dripping, no rushing water, no fear. Just silence, clean and dry. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally exhale. They tried to drown me. Instead, they rebuilt my home, got investigated, got replaced, and learned a lesson so expensive it might as well be engraved on a plaque. A plaque that would read, "Next time, don't mess with the guy downhill." Life has a way of testing people, not with the grand catastrophes we imagine, but with the quiet injustices we're expected to tolerate. It would have been easy for me to shrug, accept the flooding as unfortunate, and let the HOA brush me aside like so many others. But sometimes, the only thing standing between right and wrong is the person willing to say, enough. Standing up for yourself isn't about being loud, it's about being persistent, patient, and unwilling to let fear or exhaustion silence you. This experience reminded me that fairness doesn't happen on its own. You create it, defend it, fight for it. And when you do, you're not just protecting your own home, you're protecting everyone who never knew how to speak up. If you've ever dealt with an unfair HOA, a bad neighbor, or someone abusing authority, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real-life HOA stories. Because trust me, there's always another one coming.